versus yesterday. All right. So good to see / hear everybody. We probably will have some, I'm guessing, some additional ones come in here in a little bit. Anybody remember what we talked about last week?
Calvinism versus Arminianism.
Correct. I would have also accepted Jesus and God as acceptable Sunday school answers. And is that Mickey under his CIA pseudonym iPhone?
Yes, but I'm also here at the church. We're just trying to pick up the volume.
I managed to not capitalize the I this time because I pulled.
You're gonna have to mute yours and turn the volume down.
I'm signing off. I'm here at the church.
Okay. So, all right. Good morning, everybody. So, yeah, we talked about Calvinism versus Arminianism, and we actually spent a little bit of time covering. Anybody remember what nation's history we covered a little bit of in that process? Dutch. We also accepted the Netherlands. Would also have accepted tangentially Holland. Yeah. We talked a little bit about part of the reason for setting that historical context, a couple of reasons for setting that historical context, is that Arminius, Jacob Arminius, was Dutch. And a lot of this came out of what was going on politically, as well as in the religious, the theological conflict of what was happening there in the Netherlands. So setting that history was sort of important for the discussion. And then late in the discussion, we watched a short little video where we sort of covered the 5 elements of the most common way that we tend to think about this debate, which is, anybody remember what the acronym is? TULIP. Bonus points, because we're not going to start with the T. Bonus points for somebody who can tell me what the I stands for.
Irresistible grace.
I was very particular which one I pointed out because that one was not in Kathy's notes. So I wanted to see if you can actually, oh, it's off to the side. Okay, I'm sorry. Irresistible grace. Of course, T for total depravity, U for unconditional election, L for limited atonement, I for irresistible grace, and P for perseverance of the saints. So we're going to come back to that at the end of today. And the goal is today, we're going to get past this Arminian thing, but it's really important because we're going to be coming back to it time and time again. So we're going to do 2 parts of it. And the next week we'll actually be poised to talk about where in the world do Baptists come from, because we're about up to that point now to really dig into that. So unfortunately or fortunately, depending upon your point of view, we're going to need to spend a little bit more time in history today, but hopefully you'll see that it's relevant. And then we'll come back around and sort of have a discussion around the TULIP again, just to make sure we all have the same sort of understandings about what's going on inside of that so that we can build upon that. The history is particularly that I'm going to use one of the Ryan Reeves videos again, the same one we were using last week. And we're going to pick up here where he's actually talking about Arminius himself, because I think it is an important consideration to understand who Arminius was in order to understand when we talk about Arminianism, what it is and what it isn't from his perspective. Because what you're going to discover as we go through this little study of history is Arminianism mostly comes to be something that is understood after Arminius dies. And so his name is applied to it, but understanding what he wrote and taught versus what is an important consideration. So any questions about anything from last week that may be lingering before we jump into something new? And just so I'm clear, who's all hiding behind what I see? I know there's a lot of folks that are there because you're at the church under Bill's computer. That's Doug and Bill. Mickey, you're there as well. Is that correct? Oh, using Mickey for the audio. All right. We'll figure this out as we go. All right. first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to see a little bit of a video. This one's going to run for about 15 minutes. I apologize for the length. There was no good way to cut it up. I looked closely last night at how I could cut it up, so I apologize for that. Let me get into screen share mode, and let me also make sure it is optimized for sharing audio. There we go. And so again, if you'll just let me know when you can hear this, that's important for me to know. Here we go.
Arminius. And why was his theology so repugnant to Calvinists there in the Netherlands?
Can y'all hear that okay?
Yeah.
All right.
Sounds like you. Oh, really?
We're turning it up. We're turning it up for us here. All right.
Well, Jacob Arminius is one of these men who has a number of things to say theologically against Calvinism, but he's not the typical man that most people think that he is. In the modern world, those who are aware of the Arminian versus Calvinist debate often get the impression, I think, that these are opposing, fully opposite, one from the east and one from the west, theological perspectives that don't actually come from the same wellspring. For those who are Calvinist, Arminius is the great theological rebel who challenges the orthodoxy of their positions. On the other hand, those who are Arminian today, at least, tend to see Calvinism or the Reformed faith on the issues of predestination, etc., as the great scourge and pox on the Christian faith all these centuries. Well, the fact of the matter is Arminius was actually a Calvinist, believe it or not. Arminius was born in the Netherlands. He eventually studied at the University of Leiden, and he began to work through his subjects of the arts, etc. Then in 1580, he goes down to the city of Geneva to study there personally. Now, that should be an indication to you. Arminius is at this time, as were most people in the northern part of the Netherlands, part and parcel to the wider Reformed world. He is not coming out of left field. He's coming from within the house. So in 1580, he goes down to Geneva. Now, at this point, he is actually studying with Theodore Beza.
I'm going to pause because it's fresh on Kathy's face. I don't know which horror movie that's from, the Drew Barrymore picture, but I think it's Scream. I've never seen it, but the reference there is the phone call is coming from inside the house. So that's, he throws in these little humor things. You just have to indulge them sometimes.
Beza had been, of course, the successor to Calvin. He had a number of unique theological positions that were at least an intensification of Calvin's ideas, which we'll see in a minute. But he was certainly part of the Reformed faith. He was one of the next generation of leaders of what it would mean to be Reformed. In the 1580s, while Arminius is there is actually no serious tussling or fighting between Arminius and Beza or anyone else. Arminius comes under fire a bit while he's there, mostly due to the logical system that he had embraced at the University of Leiden. This is a system known as Ramist Logic, and it had a set of principles as to how to reason through certain problems and come to conclusions. This is hardly a theological debate, though. This is more about method. Arminius is not ostracized. You're not going to find some kind of Freudian daddy complex where Arminius goes to Geneva, gets shunned or treated poorly, and then he goes back to the Netherlands and complains about all those bullies down there. We actually have from Beza himself, just as Arminius is leaving, a note of praise and a recommendation to those back in the Netherlands that they receive Arminius as a man of strong theological conviction. It's a bit ironic, you might say, but still, Beza.
Real quick, I'm asking Don to stop it because Beza, have we heard about him before today?
No, and again, we could literally spend a year if we went through all of these individual
No.
theologians. Beza was a student of Calvin, and one of the ones who helped it, was a strong adherent for Calvinism and was a strong force in the Reformed movement for the Calvinist side of the Reformed movement, not the Lutheran side, but the
And
Calvinist.
he was in Geneva when
Arminius is in Geneva. Remember, Calvin is French, but goes and most of the time that he's in a pastorate position of authority is in the Swiss Confederation in Geneva. So Geneva, what we think, I'll call it Switzerland. It's not Switzerland at this time, but Switzerland is sort of the most centralized point for Reformed thought / Calvinist thought. And Beza is, again, a student of Calvin who becomes one of the most prolific teachers and theologians continue to expand the thought.
Sorry.
Because remember the time frame here. We're in the late 16th century, early 17th century. Calvin is born in the early 16th century. So we're now into that second generation, if you will, of Calvinists, or third generation even of Calvinists, or in some cases the third and fourth generation now of the Reformation, if you date it from 1517.
During the time that Arminius was in Geneva, saw no problem. Arminius really raised no issues while he was there. This has always been part of the problem of determining what drives Arminius to eventually challenge a few of the points, in particular of Beza. There is no single consensus on this. Most tend to lean towards the idea that Arminius might have harbored some doubt while in Geneva. He never expressed these doubts. If he did, why would Beza have sent this note of recommendation back? And it seems more that when Arminius takes up the role of a pastor back in the Netherlands after his time in Geneva, that as he is preaching through certain texts, and as he is noticing some of the developments within the Reformed faith in terms of the development of the articulation of the doctrine of predestination, that Arminius becomes a bit of a rebel, or at least he begins to experience some doubts about the way these things are being described. Now, we're going to carry on the story, at least in terms of the history of it, before we get into the theological debate, because you need to see how this unfolds first. Arminius comes back, and he is a pastor, as I've just said. There are two little blips on the screen in terms of people being concerned with what Arminius has to say. In particular, when he is preaching through Romans. When he gets to Romans 7 and 8, Arminius issues a couple of claims during his sermons that seem to go against some of the more traditional ways that Reformed people were reading these texts, at least in the context of his own day. People fight against this a little bit, but again, he is not run out of town, and he is not yet a man who is considered to be the founder of an alternative to the Reformed position. There are more debates, though, and more controversies begin to arise in 1603 when Arminius is appointed a professor of theology at the University of Leiden. Now, of course, Arminius had been to the University of Leiden, but now he was being appointed a professor of theology. It's at this point that those who are committed, we might say Calvinists, or at least committed Reformed folks, in particular a man by the name of Gomarus, begin to raise serious doubts about Arminius' teaching. They begin to believe that he is a bit of a wolf in sheep's clothing there in their midst. A lot of the debate here, though, does not so much hinge on Geneva or on Beza. Rather, in the early 1600s, in those first few years, Arminius seems to have been churned off by, amongst others, the writings of a man by the name of William Perkins, who was an
I'm going to pause it here, just to give a break to the video, but also to insert this, because this is also why are we talking about Dutch? Again, I'm talking about the Dutch, what's going on in the Netherlands. Perkins is English. And so what you're going to see here again is this influence that's going on across borders. So what's happening in Geneva, which is, we'll just again call that Switzerland to shortcut it. Arminius goes back to be a pastor and then a professor in the Netherlands, where he's from, because he's Dutch. But he ends up responding here to a writer who is English. So these ideas are crossing across borders, and they're crossing across traditions. At this time, Perkins in England, what's the church in England? The Anglican Church. So the fact that Perkins is going to espouse a very strong Reformed position, he's in the minority even in England. He's among that group of the Puritans and the Separatists and the others that are there that aren't necessarily directly in line with still what is the Reformed Church in England, only it's the Anglican version of the Reformed Church, not the other part. So again, there's lots of pieces to this puzzle. I just wanted you to note the fact that Perkins is English, Arminius is Dutch, but he studied in Switzerland. This is very international in its way.
Englishman, a man who had studied at the University of Cambridge and who was himself one of the foremost Puritan theologians there in the English context. At some point in these early years, Arminius is either asked or he himself elects to write a book against William Perkins. Perkins would eventually become a fellow there at Cambridge, and it was there in the context of being a fellow that Perkins writes a real stout defense of the doctrine of predestination. The title of the book was called On the Order and Mode of Predestination. Now, in its original context, William Perkins is essentially asserting and trying to defend a real robust, serious understanding of the Reformed faith for his English audience. Now, this is towards the end of Elizabeth's reign and just prior to the rise of James I. Again, this is the tussling back and forth. And Perkins is one of these Puritan folks who wants to assert and defend the theological positions that they believed had been part and parcel to the Anglican ethos from the very beginning. Perkins' position on the doctrine of predestination might be said to be a bit extreme, not necessarily in terms of content, but one of the things that is always noted about the transition from Calvin to this early phase of Calvinism is that as certain doctrines become contested, they tend to be separated from the entirety of the theological complex of ideas, and they get separated and therefore examined on their own. Now, this is a good thing in lots of ways. If there's a contentious issue, a contentious doctrine, well, it makes sense to write a specific book just on this doctrine. Calvin himself actually, of course, wrote a book just like this. There were those in Calvin's day, mostly from the Catholic perspective, who were challenging Calvin's understanding of predestination. And it fits in that case just the same way that Luther wrote The Bondage of the Will in response to Erasmus. However, in the case of William Perkins, the extent to which he is discussing the doctrine of predestination, you might say, is what is new. The fact that he's talking about the order and the mode of it, the fact that he is going into...
Just want to pause it here. I actually found this chart elsewhere. If I were doing a PowerPoint, I would have included this. This is him describing in graphical form how salvation works. Any questions?
That's busy.
It's busy, to say the least, and it's complicated, right? The reason I stopped it here was to point out a couple of things, again, that sort of are part of the narrative here, is that, as Dr. Reeve just pointed out, it's now entered that phase where they're really starting to drill down on individual parts of this at such depth that the danger is to lose the big concept in the little concept, if that makes any sense. And then the other thing you probably heard it there in Reeve's description, Arminius is going to be pulling back in a slightly different direction. By the way, the key takeaway here is Arminius is a Calvinist. Later we're going to see this as being, as he pointed out, an opposition kind of debate, but he comes out of the Reformed Calvinist tradition. He's just challenging elements of it that he thinks have gone, in this case of Perkins, too far. So one way you might frame this sort of thing that happens here, because obviously his writing against, Arminius choosing to write against what Perkins had wrote, is that he thinks Perkins has gone too far in one direction. And then the argument's going to be made that Arminius has gone too far back in the other direction. But I just wanted to stop so you could, just sort of appreciate, again, the complexity of this sort of order of salvation, the chain of salvation here as it's talking about, to understand just the level of detail they were starting to drill down into. Any questions or comments about that?
Like, what are some of the points? Because to me, that to explain that to a child about how to be saved.
Yeah, and what this flows through here is this is looking at, for example, there's creation, there's the fall of Adam. So this is sort of his historical working out of how salvation works. And then eventually gets down here, what you see at the bottom is this is God's glory. So this is all for God's glory. Starting with, you see sort of that classic representation of the Trinity at the top, and then it comes down. And then there's but it's interesting, so there's predestination right there. It's very high. It's primary in his golden chain of salvation. It doesn't come later. His suggestion, which is illustrated by this chart, is that predestination is highly important. God's choosing who is going to be saved is a very early thing.
into questions of God's eternal decrees and at what point there is a selection of who will be chosen to eternal life and who will be chosen to eternal death, does on some level seem to be a bit of a new stage. In this sense, there is some historical evidence to say that what William Perkins is doing by separating a doctrine in this way and discussing it to such a heavy extent tends to pull the doctrine of predestination from its moorings within the overall understanding of God's salvation and some of the other understandings of Reformed theology. Not everyone has been happy with William Perkins, both in his own context and ever since. Even those who are Reformed have found William Perkins to, again, be a bit more zealous on this doctrine than he perhaps should have been. Now, we don't have to go there. We don't have to make it a moral judgment. Rather, what William Perkins is doing is discussing the doctrine of predestination on its own, and as a result, there were some who found it to be not the best move. Well, to be frank, that is exactly where Arminius comes from. One of Arminius' main works, in fact, is on this doctrine of predestination, and it was written right here in 1602, though it is not published for some years. And it actually is an attack on the excesses to which William Perkins takes the logical conclusions that he feels are necessary when discussing the doctrine of predestination. In other words, in 1602, and all the way until the end of his life, Arminius is working from within the Reformed position, and he is beginning to become unhappy with where he thinks the discussions have come. So he writes the book in 1602. He is then appointed professor of Leiden in 1603. The problem, though, is, of course, the book is unpublished, and so no one really fully knows where Arminius stands on these things. A lot of what goes on from 1603 for the next 6 years until Arminius dies is more of an in-house discussion and debate than it is a publishing war. When Arminius dies, his book against Perkins is eventually published. And that's important because during his lifetime, during the last 6 years of his life, Arminius is not known overtly for his theological position, at least not in terms of publication and for the wider theological world. Within the Netherlands, he is known and his views are becoming more and more apparent. And so what begins as an in-house debate eventually will take on a wider cast as other Reformed folks from different countries begin to take note of someone from within their theological position challenging some of the opinions of where the Reformed faith has come.
So does that make sense? Any questions about that? Arminius is a Reformed theologian. He, from his perspective, is pushing back against someone he believes who's gone too extreme on the doctrine of predestination. But this is essentially a discussion, a theological discussion, a theological debate, all within the context of when I use the word reform here, the broader Reformation, but particularly that element of the Reformation that is the Calvin's theology, the Reformed position, the Calvinist position. He writes the book against Perkins in 1602, but the book is not published until after he dies. So there are people who knew him, who talked to him, who knew what his position was, who certainly knew that he had written this thing. Apparently he was concerned enough about where Perkins was going that he took the time to write. Remember, you don't do that unless you're really fired up about that. But it wasn't in the public domain. This was still inside of theological circles, inside the university there in Leiden and other places like that. So this is an in-house theological discussion. In much the same way, I see similarities here to who that we've talked about. See the similarities to Luther? Luther wanted to have a discussion inside of the church. Arminius wanted to have a discussion inside of those who held to Reformed theology.
So Don, was the extreme position of Perkins, did it have more to do with him making predestination sort of a very primary thing versus just
you saw that in that chart. Remember how I pointed out it was way up on the chart?
Right. Yeah.
And also I like the way Reeves describes it here, and I haven't read enough all the details of this, but there's other parts of, if you will, just using the TULIP acronym, there's other parts other than the U. There's other parts other than the unconditional election, which is where the concept of predestination is contained. If you sort of pull the U out from the rest of it and focus too much on that, you lose the big picture. In my mind, it's analogous to what we can all be guilty of, which is pulling scripture out of context. Where if you lose the big picture anchoring that it's inside of, you're looking at something that is true, but you need to look at the whole element of the truth, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's what Perkins had sort of done here, and that's what Arminius was challenging back, saying you've gone too far. Not that you don't have, not that you're not starting from the right place, and again, not that you're not starting from scripture, but you've gone too far in that direction, and you need to pull it back. And so that's what he writes about, and then he dies, and then his work gets published. So those who start using his work to push back against that wing, if you will, of Calvinist / Reformed theology, start getting called Arminians. Not so much because they're necessarily touting a new theology that Arminius has brought up, but they're touting the position of Arminius being a critic of somebody that he views has gone too far extreme in the other direction. I know that seems subtle, but do you understand why that's different?
I mean, I think so. So basically, Perkins and Arminius had a maybe an agreement on the idea of predestination, but
yeah, or certainly not. They probably definitely agreed on the idea, because predestination also, as we talked about last week and I guess the week before, ties back into the attribute of God's sovereignty, right?
right. But Perkins just pushed it to a limit of almost where it became the focus of faith.
Right. And I think the thing that's probably fair to say, without having knowing specifically how they stood on every issue, my guess is Arminius and Perkins would have agreed on 90 or 95% of their theology. Where they obviously disagree, particularly on this, Perkins specifically writes on the order and mode of what? Predestination. And Arminius writes back, in fact, it's entitled An Examination of Perkins. They're talking about that particular point. It's an important point, but it's not the only point that's existing in theology. That's the point that I want to make here, even inside the Reformed movement. They were both Reformed theology thinkers. They just differed, and apparently they begin to differ pretty widely on the element of predestination inside of that. And it probably will be in a part that I'm not going to play here of Reeves's lecture, but I know he mentions it later. So if you hear it, we did get to that. But so often today, when we talk about somebody being Calvinist, what is the one thing we pick up on? Predestination. Well, Calvin had a lot of other thoughts on a lot of other things, not just predestination. That just becomes the most contentious theological point around which things are centered, if that makes any sense. Any other questions or comments? We're almost done with this section.
So in 1603, Gomarus and a few others begin to allege that Arminius is not only unreformed, but that he is a Pelagian and a Catholic. Now, there eventually is a meeting, a synod of some kind.
So let's talk about that. Does anybody remember? I think we touched on this in passing. We didn't spend a lot of time on it. Does anybody remember what Pelagius taught, or what Pelagianism would be?
Oh, I've forgotten. I've studied that, but I don't remember.
So obviously, if you're on the Reformed side, calling him a Catholic is something that's gonna it's gonna set off some fireworks, right? Pelagius basically taught a doctrine that said that we were not tainted by original sin. And so Pelagianism, which was later condemned as a heresy in one of the latter parts of those councils that we looked at, basically said that it was possible for a human to basically live a holy life if they strove for it, because they did not have to overcome the taint of original sin.
So what I'm seeing here is that they have the free will to achieve human perfection without divine grace.
Right. And the free will part of that, thank you for jumping in with that, Donna. That's the important, that's the connection here that they make when they're going after Arminius, because predestination suggests what about man's will? His free will. That at a minimum it's limited, and it may not even exist, because who's choosing salvation? God. So when Arminius begins to push back against predestination, talking about the role that man can have, this idea of prevenient grace that we were talking about last week, they connect that, taking him to the extreme of, oh, you're talking like Pelagius did, by the way, almost a millennia ago. That was in the late 400s and early 500s, if I'm remembering the dates correctly. They're basically saying, oh, that's heresy. What you're talking about is heresy because that's Pelagianism, which is not what Arminius was arguing. He was just arguing a different position on the role of our free will and our choice in salvation than the hard position of, I almost want to call them right-wing and left-wing Calvinists, but that's not the right way to do it, but a much harder position on predestination inside of the Calvinistic Reformed theology that Perkins represented. I mean, that's a lot of, does that make sense?
I guess another element from what I'm seeing here is that Pelagius believed that Adam's sin was solely his and that it didn't pass down through the human race.
Right. That we are not tainted by that original sin. And thus we have the ability not only to choose, but we also have the ability to achieve this salvation or the perfect life. And as you can easily see, based upon our understanding of Scripture, why that was considered heretical. Not hard to see where that was. So this charge is leveled against Arminius, that he's sliding back towards Catholicism, that he's not really reformed, and beyond that, he's not just not really reformed, he's a heretic, he's a Pelagianist.
Kind, where Arminius is asked to give his opinions on things, and unfortunately, the charge that he was Pelagian or a Catholic was very hard to make stick. And so Arminius is able to stand before them and say, no, I am not a Pelagian, I am not a Catholic, I believe in the full inerrant scriptures, just as Calvin does. And he, being a man who had studied in Geneva, was very well equipped to defend himself here. And so in the end, the decision of the council is to not affirm that he is in defiance of the traditional opinions of Protestantism. They then ask him to have a conference with Gomarus to see if their differences on these opinions can come to an amicable conclusion. Arminius does agree. Gomarus himself also agrees. But in the end, in 1609, with his health failing, Arminius is unable to do this, and so he dies. Now, this is important because Arminius is, in some ways, the instigator of what we would call the Arminian rejection of Calvinism. But there's a couple of things we have to understand here. First of all, Arminius, as we'll see in a minute, does not fully reject Calvinism or the Reformed faith. Rather, he thinks he is tweaking it to be that much the better. He thinks, in other words, that he's working from within their own theological house, but he thinks that Calvinism has gone off the rails, and therefore he is suggesting some changes that will make it better. The other thing is, Arminius dies before really anything like an Arminian movement can get going. In many ways, throughout the centuries, there are so many different varieties of the ways people use the teachings of Arminius that to say someone is Arminian might or might not mean that they are very close to the actual teachings of Arminius himself.
That's probably one of the most important things I want us to grasp here, is that we use that term in a modern sense today Calvinist versus Arminianist. Both of those have broader context. And so just to say that someone is an Arminian, as Reeve just pointed out there, does not mean that if Arminius saw what that person is claimed to believe, that he would agree with that. His name has been appropriated and is now used in a couple of different contexts there. And that's a really important thing to grasp. There's not just one flavor of what today gets called Arminianism. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
In fact, later, or I'm going to stop the history thing. He's about to say this, I know, on the video next, but later in the Methodist movement, as Methodism comes into being, John Wesley is going to appropriate and use elements of Arminianism, so much so that there's a version of Arminianism that essentially is called Wesley's or Wesleyan Arminianism, to distinguish it from classic Arminianism. There's enough of a difference between the two that you need to distinguish that. Yet a broad stroke that would be painted is that they are both Arminius, if that makes any sense.
In other words, he dies just as the fight really gets going. He dies even before the Synod of Dort, which means that what is claimed to be Arminian, while certainly very faithful to him, is more the ongoing unfolding of what is being claimed by the name Arminianism than it is actually his own teachings. I'll just put it this way. We've only really had biographies of who Arminius was really in the last, say, 5 to 10 years. There's been a recommitment by historians to really delve into the man. We also have not had much in terms of an actual historical, critical understanding of his theology. What we have had, though, are people who, in the modern world in particular, claim the name Arminianism, but who themselves might change or adapt or overthrow some of the even core principles of Arminius himself. And just to look down into a later lecture, when we get to the person of John Wesley, for example, John Wesley will in many ways reorient and reestablish the word Arminianism to be his theology, not the actual teachings of Arminius in full. And so historians talk about there's classical Arminianism, there's Wesleyan Arminianism, and there's other versions of Arminianism that are out there in the modern world all the way down until today. What we are concerned about here, though, is what did Arminius himself actually teach?
I'm going to stop the history part here so we can slip back over into the non-history part. Any questions or comments, though, just about that background and about Arminius himself?
Nope.
All right, so now I'm going to, if I can manage to do it, I might be able to manage to do it. Got lots of screens working here. Let's get back into the report. And now let me share the screen again. All right. So here's an important concept to put in. This idea of tulip, which we use so frequently, which is so handy. Nobody in the time frame that we're talking about here, during Arminius's life, shortly after his death, while the discussion is going on about him versus Perkins, nobody is using this analogy or this acronym specifically to define that. That's a modern thing. It's an English thing. Where this does come, though, and this is important, you've heard reference multiple times there to the Synod of Dort. So let me talk about what the Synod of Dort is. The Synod of Dort was a gathering, a national gathering in the Netherlands to see if they could come to a national understanding of inside the national church. Remember the discussion last week about the conflict between whether it was a local church thing or whether it was a national church thing? What eventually happens is there comes to be a national gathering where they debate this, and the 5 points that you sort of see here were not framed by those that were on the traditional Calvinist side of the argument. The 5 points were actually framed by those who were on the Arminius side of the argument. And then the Council of Dort responds back to them to sort of create the things which eventually get converted into Tulip. So do you follow that line of reasoning? They're actually responding to the criticism.
Responding to the criticism of,
Those that were holding to more of what Arminius had started. Kathy just asked what year it was. I'd have to go back and look. I don't have it handy here in my notes. I can pull it down though. So why would we focus on this? What, the most important thing is, what is the application of this? It was in 1618 and 1619. So why is this relevant to us today? Why go through this whole background? Why even expose ourselves to the debate between those who were more traditionally Reformed or Calvinists and those that were leaning towards more of the accepting some of the criticisms that they viewed as being rightful criticisms that Arminius brought
to understand how there were splits and divisions of theological thought as time went on.
Yeah. And the fact that we continue to have this debate raging down theologically to some degree to today. So what they ended up doing at the Synod of Dort was that they ended up coming to an agreement about what would be the teachings. And the Synod Dort rejected the Arminian position. It reaffirmed this side of things more, which expressed here in using the tulip side in showing Calvinism versus the Arminian side. So that's why, even though the Arminius brought up sort of the 5 points, it's sort of this organized response that comes out of the Synod of Dort. And that's why we look at it from this perspective. That's why it's, first of all, the tulip works pretty well. I'm not sure what PCURC would be. It's not as nice as an acronym. So that's the other reason for it not coming out that way.
John, this may be a silly question, but under the Arminianism, the conditional security, what are we talking about in terms of salvation, or what is that?
We talked about this a little last week too, Sherry, is that the Arminian position does not hold to eternal security. The pure Arminius position, depending on what that means based upon the conversation that we just had 5 minutes ago, or that we just referenced, does not hold to perseverance of the saints.
So this means you can lose your salvation.
You can lose your salvation.
Okay.
And where that ties together is in the Arminian position, you have more of a choice, and you have a choice. You have more of a choice in your salvation, right? Which also means that you are at risk of what it means to not have God being sovereign in you. Again, for me personally, growing up in a Baptist church and in Baptist doctrine, perseverance of the saints is a very, very, very security of the believer. We have terms that we use to describe that. I would call that very much a modern Baptist doctrinal point of view, right? Which side of the ledger does it fall on? The more pure Calvinist position. What I was taught growing up in a Southern Baptist church, very much in some of the other areas, conditional election, resistible grace, this idea that we choose through a salvation experience, that we choose to follow. It's actually contained there in in the hymn often sung for an invitation. I have decided to follow Jesus. Think about what that statement means in this question. Who decided? Me. I decided, which means I had a choice to follow. That very much falls on the Arminian side of the equation in terms of how it would have been thought of back during the time that they were debating this at the Synod of Dort. So I would argue, and I think correctly so, that, for example, modern Baptist theology, when it comes to salvation, is a blending and a mixture of these two modes of thought. I'm certainly not a 5-point Calvinist, but I sure do like the P, right?
Absolutely.
It's a little scary that we can resist God's grace. I talked before, probably the most controversial thing tends to be this idea of limited atonement. Well, limited only in the sense of, I think I used that coupon analogy last week. It's limited to those who actually, you could argue it's limited to those who take advantage of it, that it was intended for all, but only those who take advantage of it.
Okay, real quick, I'm going to read what Donna just sent me. She said, I found an acronym for Arminianism. DAISY.
Daisy, okay.
DAISY. Okay, are you ready?
Sure.
Diminished depravity, abrogated impersonal atonement, sedentary grace, yieldable justification.
Okay. So what we have is a battle.
Response to a tulip is the daisy.
Is the daisy. Okay. I'd not seen that before, but now as I do a Google search here on the other screen, I do see it. So basically this is all about daisy.
Okay, but they had to make these words up, because what does abrogated even mean? I'm sorry. That's not a word that I use on a daily basis.
Abrogated means that you can reject it, basically.
You can abrogate.
I kind of, in response to what the other one is, but is that a common word? Do you use abrogated in everyday language?
I mean, I do occasionally, not often.
Okay, I can't, I was proud of myself for knowing how to say it, but I've seen it before, but I can't remember the last time I've ever said it.
The actual definition is to repeal or do away with.
Yeah.
Or evade.
I agree, Kathy. It sounds like they were searching. They had to
They were like, okay, we have tulips.
really look for something to fit.
Oh yeah, I definitely think that's the case, Sharon.
And again, to me, the interesting part of that was the original thing that led to the tulip response was that the Arminius had proposed, they didn't obviously use that, but they had proposed daisy. That produced the tulip response. Is part of what's here. So again, bringing this back to application, why does it matter?
Well, it changes. If I believe that there's no choice out there, why would I support missionaries? Why would I tell anybody about the gospel? Why would I say what Jesus has done in my life? Because my hands are off of it. Everything is dependent on God. Thank goodness he, chose me, but I can't choose anybody else. And my work towards other believers
is not necessary, because if it's not me, God's got it figured out some other way without.
God's going to take care of it. So hands off.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most common modes of expression that's used to be I could just call it a modern criticism of the Calvinist viewpoint to its extreme is there is no need for or requirement for evangelism. So how would you counter that? How would a Calvinist counter that? Not how an Arminius would counter that. That's pretty obvious. In order to exercise free will, people have to be told, have to be aware. How would a Calvinist respond back to what Kathy just said? Because that is that's one of the probably top 2 or 3 criticisms that's labeled against those who would be more leaning towards being 5-point Calvinists.
I think it would depend on how extreme a Calvinism person is.
Okay.
But I had a professor that said the reality is that we don't know. And so we don't do anything different. We continue to share the gospel because we're commanded to. And I also think that we can't know what role we play in God's sovereignty with the commandment to do so.
Right. I think you hit upon a very important thing there, Don, in the sense that we are commanded to go forth and make disciples, not go forth as Aaron preached on a couple of weeks ago, not go forth and make converts, but to go forth and make disciples. But in order to make disciples, what's the first thing that has to happen? They have to be
Converted.
So Jesus very specifically gave that command. So even if you do believe that, that person that comes to be saved, that was purely at God's sovereignty, to your point, what role do we play in that? We're still commanded to go, whether God would do it some other way because he's already, his foreknowledge and his predestination, again, whatever term you want to apply to that, doesn't matter. We're still commanded to go do what we're supposed to do.
I guess the counter argument back to that, though, would be, yes, we were commanded to do it. I mean, I've heard both arguments, especially because we've talked about this before, but why would he command us to do something that has no
purpose?
Yeah.
Because here's my response to that. We're only thinking about that from a finite mind.
Right.
Yeah.
100% agree. And we could, the problem is you can sit there and do this circular argument.
Right.
About, well, if God decides, kind of the thing, but he tells us still to do it. I don't know. Again, I think part of my biggest problem with this is that having not really had to think about it because I wasn't exposed to it until I was older, I think my mind was kind of already set and made before I was even exposed to it to really think about it in a pure sense, because I already had so much
preconceived idea.
Right.
As we all probably could say, depending on what we grew up with, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be completely different for somebody who doesn't have a background of a specific faith. Again, I had very, very, very limited exposure to anything but a Baptist church. I mean, I can think of maybe 10 times that I went to a Methodist church or something with a friend that wasn't Baptist. I mean, when we went on vacation, we would look for the Baptist church. We wouldn't necessarily not do anything that wasn't Baptist. So if I had a good friend that was Catholic and I was going to the Catholic church a lot, maybe my thinking would have been different. I just don't know. I think I already had such strong beliefs about certain things that it's hard for me to debate it now.
Well, Kathy, I grew up in the Methodist church. We went to non-denominational churches for many years. Then we started attending Baptist. But it wasn't until I actually went to Bible college that I even
Differences between his theology and
was hit with some of this stuff that, caused me to pause and just think,
And there's a reason we don't teach this to 7 and 8-year-olds in Sunday school.
Right.
This is not easy stuff. And as you know, hopefully the thing that also comes out through looking at the historical thing of this was not easy stuff even when it was going on. This was, these were very bright, very capable people. By the way, they were all looking at scripture and trying to understand what scripture said. And they were struggling with it. We struggled with it. And one of the interesting things, I forget which one of the 19th century evangelists that it was, I can't remember now which one it was, actually was a strong Calvinist, almost a 5-point Calvinist in his theology. And somebody asked him once, if you believe in this idea of unconditional election, why are you out there? Seems an odd thing for an evangelist to believe in, right? And his point was, well, God didn't tattoo a P on their stomachs or their foreheads for me to know, which ones are, so I've got to preach to everybody because I don't know which ones God has predestined. Which is just another take on that. Again, back to the being obedient to the Great Commission. Depending if you think it works that way, you still have a role in it. Yeah.
That, to me, that's kind of my biggest problem with supposedly Calvinist evangelism, because if saved truly are predestined, then God will find a way to reveal it to those predestined. And
that way might be you. You might have been predestined to introduce that person to Christ.
Yeah. Well, and that's the challenging part of it is, we talked about this at least a little bit in each of the last 2 weeks is, and it was helpful last week. I think Lori brought this up when she was part of the class again last week, was this idea of somebody mentioned, I think Donna said it earlier, or Sherry said, I know it was Donna, that, we're trying to comprehend an infinite concept of God from our finite perspective. And we are bound in our understanding of what it means to be predestined by our understanding of linear time. Guess what? God's not bound by that. And so
look at the Great Commission. It almost does sound like a Calvinist thought, because, as Pastor Eric said, it doesn't say go and convert people, it says make disciples, which implies that those who are discipled have already chosen.
And again, this comes from a reasonable reading of Romans 8, 28 and 29. And again, there's tons of verses that are used as support for both of these positions. That's what makes it hard, is that, again, I don't think either one of these positions are heretical. I think they're trying to apply a finite understanding to an infinite God. God's got this figured out, even if we can't figure it out. That's the one.
Before I was actually in a church that removed a pastor because they accused him of being a Calvinist. And I don't believe he was, but he also was just trying to explain God's sovereignty and our limited understanding and limited vocabulary.
Yeah, it's what I said a couple of weeks ago, which I believe, there's a part of us that goes, well, it's not fair that God, let's take the extreme position. God chooses. God absolutely chooses, and by that choice, he chooses. He doesn't choose some. He chooses and he unchooses, or he dischooses, whatever word you want to apply to that. The opposite of choice. Our first place to go is that what we call that not being fair, right? That's the first place we would want to go. Well, guess what? Guess what? He's a holy God. He didn't have to choose anybody. All of us deserve eternal separation because of what's there. I think you say it well, Doug. We struggle with his sovereignty and what that actually means for someone to be sovereign. Which, by the way, ties back to another concept of discipleship called lordship. You know, those things are all tied together. So we're not going to keep belaboring this particular discussion or disagreement or differences in point of views, except we will encounter it along the way as we finish up the historical study here. But it's worth camping here as we have for a couple of weeks, because this is an important introduction into our theological discussion that happens here that does influence everything that happens after here, if that makes sense. Any other questions or thoughts?
I was thinking back to that Perkins spaghetti bowl chart you showed earlier. It looked like there were two branches that came off of predestination, and the end result was salvation. I was looking at that diagram, right? But so did they believe that, or did he believe there was a way even if you weren't predestined, but you had to go through the gauntlet, or you had to have God's favor somewhere?
Let me pull it back. It's paused in the video here, so it's tough to read. Actually, this side over here is that you don't get there. There is a path where you may not get there.
I was going to say, I would think that there's no way you could get there if you're either predestined or you're not predestined. So how is the fact that you, at the end, both of them look like they get there?
I have not studied this chart in enough detail to understand
I
it.
mean, that's the other thing, you know. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So that, in a way, I noticed it earlier too, that I thought it was the black side that meant you don't get there. But if Don says it's the left, because I can't read any of that stuff. But if you're not
God intervened.
predestined, there's no way for you to get to heaven. There's not, because you haven't been predestined. And if you have been predestined, then there's no way for you to not get to heaven. And that's the problem. Again, God's sovereign, God's Lord. He's got this figured out. He's not upset that we're thinking about it, talking about it, struggling with it. But I don't know, Jesus. The answer is Jesus. So I still have a hard time, and again, it comes back to that, the way I was raised. I have a hard time believing that when Jesus died on the cross, he didn't die for everybody on the cross. Then it's who accepts that and who hears about that. So you have to hear about it to believe. You can't believe, you can't be predestined to believe and then not somehow have that way made for you. I don't know.
Which is why most of the argument does center around this third point, this idea of, was the atonement being the act on the cross, was that limited or unlimited? And you know, at first blush, thinking of Christ dying on the cross, where it says in Scripture that he died for all, thinking of that as being limited is
hard.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a good friend of ours. Kathy may know where I'm going here. We were doing an evangelistic concept, and I forget. It's the faith outline for those of you that are familiar with that. And I'm trying to remember which one that. It was the I, in the FAITH. It was a very good evangelical path that used faith as the acronym, but the I, and this is what our good friend Kenny used to absolutely hate was the I. The I stood for impossible.
Impossible for God.
And it was the concept there was it's impossible for God to allow someone to allow sin because of his holiness. And he agreed with the theology of God being holy and what that means about God's position towards sin, but he hated the fact that it said it was impossible for God, because what is impossible for God? Well, God in his absolute sovereignty, in his absolute omnipotence, nothing is impossible for God, right? And he used to just really that's been 25 years ago, and I can still I can still hear him chafing about that when we're going through it. It's just you'd see him shaking his head over there going, no, I don't like that. Can we substitute something else for that? Because we don't like the idea that something would be that in some way that something God did is limited. It's part of what that's about. Yeah, we have the idea of the kenosis that God coming in the flesh, he intentionally chose to limit himself, which is a whole other thing. Okay. This is your last chance to ask deep questions on this, because we're going to keep moving on past this. So any other thoughts or things to throw in here?
So our homework assignment is to develop our belief system into the shape of power.
Yeah. You have to come up. By the way, it has to be a 5-letter flower analogy as well.
Dibs on chrysanthemum.
Yeah. And of course, one of the ironies that's often mentioned here is that all of this was happening where? In the Netherlands, which is Dutch, and that's where the tulip, craze happened. And those two things are totally unrelated. Just it's a happenstance that this sort of English acronym to describe this was tulip. Well, a lot of this is actually happening in the Netherlands. It's Dutch. Thanks for sharing what you did, though, Don. I had never seen the daisy thing in anything that I had studied, so doesn't surprise me that it's out there.
It's kind of interesting. There's other ones out there too.
Yeah.
So.
And again, why would somebody go and create daisy? Because they wanted it to be something that's positive on their side of the ledger, right?
Right.
And again, I'm happy to be a blend of these things, because I really like the idea of security of the believer and perseverance of the saints, because I do believe that God in his sovereignty and in his omnipotence, that which is in his hand can't be plucked from his hand unless he chooses to allow it. Okay. Gonna stop the share. Does anybody have any last? I haven't stopped the recording yet. I stopped the share. All right. I'm about to stop the recording. If I can find the magical controls. And